want to thank my colleagues who have been incredibly supportive, Dr. Gleaves, Dr. Caldwellton, Dr. Nancy Jimeno, who's new to honors, but I just want to really thank them for being here. Dr. Simoens, for supporting our students and supporting me in putting this event together. Congratulations to our students. This is a culmination of at least a year-long work project. So it's the sweat, blood, and tears coming to a culmination here, and I'm really proud of all of them. A lot of them have said, oh, thank you, but really it's I who should thank them, because they're really inspirational to work with. They're super hardworking, and they humble me in every way. And so it's my pleasure and joy to work with these students. So welcome and thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Nancy Jimeno, and I will be introducing Kai and several of the other students here as we go through. But I imagine all of you know that the honors program, we have, I've heard people call them elite. I call my students excellent. That it's a joy to be teaching these students, because they really demand a lot of themselves and of us as their professors, because we have to try to keep a step ahead of them, which is very difficult. So let's start with Kai, and I'll let him talk about his topic, but it's the Beginner's Guide to Revolution. His mentor was Dr. Paulo Simoes, I think. I don't know if that person's here. Kai is a senior and graduating in the fall of 2017, a pre-law and psychology major, pre-law with Spanish as a minor. Amazing differences here. I'm in the political science department, and we get a lot of students that go on for law, so to take these two major and minor is kind of unusual. He will be attending law school in New York City and advance into international law is what he'd like to do, and specialize in U.S. Latin American policymaking. Again, you're going to take some political science classes there, right? And then work for the United Nations. So we'll let Kai go ahead and begin. I'll let you know when you're at 5 and 2 minutes. Perfect, thank you.
Do I have to click somewhere? Clicker?
We don't have one, Kai, I'm
No,
sorry.
for this one? That's totally fine.
So,
No worries.
I will
All right.
invest in one for the future, I'm sorry.
All right, well, without any further ado, my name is Kai Rendino, and this is the culmination of about a year and a half's worth of writing that I call The Beginner's Guide to Revolution. Just a brief personal note, this has been an exercise in writing. The final project is 100 pages and still growing. I plan to extend it afterwards. It's been an exercise of research, but ultimately it's been an introspective reflection through history. So before we begin, I want to show you a quick actual real-life picture of me before I started this picture and what I thought of my activism. Very effective, right? So the central question of this project was, why do people revolt? And just a quick poll, show of hands, who's 100% happy with the way things are in their lives, in their world, whatever it is? You wouldn't change a thing. I don't see a single hand. Which brings me to my central point. We as humans have this condition called relative deprivation, which is when we feel we're entitled to something because we've either put in the work or we were born to it, whatever it is, we feel that we're not getting our needs met. And this is really a central condition to revolution, but also we need to understand what a paradigm is. It's a central model of knowledge that we use as framework to either approach a discipline or a problem. It's basically a guiding philosophy through our life that answers and structures what is observed and scrutinized, the kinds of questions that are supposed to be asked, how these questions are even supposed to be structured, and in a scientific sense, how the results of investigations need to be interpreted. The original idea of a paradigm shift in the scientific sense comes from the structure of scientific revolutions from Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher and scientist, in which he says that a field progresses in a series of peaceful interludes punctuated by intellectually violent revolutions. He was specifically talking about the scientific revolution of Copernicus and Galileo. However, I took this concept of a paradigm shift and I extended it to any other type of revolution you might be able to imagine, with the intention of generalizing our working definition of what it means to revolt or have a revolution. In Kuhn's cycle, the first step is pre-science, in which there is no workable paradigm at all. Essentially, we're all just out there doing things willy-nilly, and we really don't know what answers need questions, what questions need answers, and yeah. Eventually, we move into normal science, which is when we have a paradigm that effectively answers any real question that we need answered. There's really no problems. However, over time, we start to see anomalies start to accumulate within our paradigm, and we really can't start answering the questions that need answered. Eventually, the anomalies accumulate so much that the paradigm breaks down itself, and it's no longer a reliable guide to problem solving at all, and we start seeing alternative paradigms emerge in what's called a model revolution, when we have competing paradigms kind of just fighting over hegemony in whatever discipline or field you're working with. Finally, one of these single paradigms will emerge above the rest and answer all of the unanswered questions and provide a more workable framework for how we should approach life. This is just kind of a brief example or a graphic of how the cycle works, and as you can see, it is cyclical. So what was once normal science will eventually fall into model crisis, and we will eventually find new models of normal science. So I took this to examine 4 different types of revolutions with the intention of expanding our working definition. The first one in culture, the second one in religion, the third one in science, and the fourth one in politics. So there's my political interest for you. The first cultural revolution that I expanded on was the Neolithic Revolution, which was when we moved from nomadic hunting and gathering to agriculture and the domestication of animals about 12,000 years ago. It was really kicked off by the end of the last ice age when the glaciers receded, revealing a greater abundance of food. Essentially, we didn't have to move as far to find the food, and we could settle down and start building up villages and permanent roots. Agriculture in particular developed in many different locations independent of each other, so we can see that a revolution does not necessarily need to spread from one location to another. It can actually be inspired from similar problems entirely separate. So in the Fertile Crescent, China, Europe, Africa, New Guinea, and the Americas each developed their own forms of agriculture. Furthermore, the domestication of animals started long before agriculture, first with what appears to be the dog, with anatomically modern remains appearing next to a human burial site in the Oberkassel site in Bonn, Germany. And what this tells us is a couple things years prior to this discovery, but also that these animals held a very revered place in human society, enough to garner a respectful burial for them with their human companions. Our experience domesticating the dog eventually led us to understand how to domesticate the barnyard animals like sheep and goats, which became very prominent in the Fertile Crescent around 9000 BC. So even though we now had an overabundance of food, we could grow our population to about 10 to 50 times what it was in the Paleolithic period. It wasn't all fun and games. We were able to develop a civilization as we would recognize it today. We would see towns and city centers and specializations of peoples. We would see nutrient availability in plants rise, increasing our nutrients just absorbed from food. We're getting more out of a smaller amount of food because we're selecting for those traits. And for the first time in human history, we're able to control and distribute large quantities of food. However, we also were now more susceptible to pathogens because we were living more closely to animals than ever before, but also our food crops were much more susceptible to getting wiped out by a single infection. So an attack on double fronts. Our dental health degraded because we were now consuming softer carbohydrates as opposed to the tougher wild varieties. So we get cavities and things like that, which never happened before. And finally, we start having intra-species competition as opposed to interspecies competition, which means that we're no longer fighting other animals for food resources, but we're fighting other humans for food resources and other resources in general, which ultimately leads to resource wars, a pretty common theme throughout the rest of human history. So here's just a brief map of all of the different hubs of development in agriculture. As you can see, it happens over a very long span of time and also in many different locations. which should be your first expansion of the definition of revolution. It doesn't need to happen all at once, and it doesn't need to happen in the same place necessarily. It just requires many people shifting their thinking towards a new paradigm. The second revolution I looked at was the onset of monotheism, which played a particular role, or a particular influence on myself, because 84% of the population currently believes in some form of organized religion. Personally, I do not. However, I have always felt longing and this religious search for meaning, I guess, throughout my life. And this has been a particularly powerful introspective chapter for me. So it's suspected that the first real religious beliefs was one of pantheism or animism. And we can kind of see that humans have been practicing some form of religion or other for a very long time based on the findings at a modern day cave in Israel called Jebel Qaseh, where 100,000-year-old bodies were found in either partially flexed or fully flexed positions. And then also in his 1912 book on the origin of the idea of God, Father Wilhelm Schmidt posits a pantheistic sky god that kind of is the great ancestor of modern monotheism. Essentially, it's what he expects the base level of humans to have worshipped before the introduction of organized religion. And we see this also by studying modern untouched tribes in Africa, like the Igbo tribe, whose concepts of Chukwu most closely mirrors that of the Western concept of a soul. And it's found in every plant, animal, and even non-inanimate objects like this desk. Essentially, they believe that there's no distinction between the physical and the spiritual world, and that everything is God, and that there is no distinction. But it's very hard to understand these things because they don't even have a word for their religious beliefs. And from there we move into polytheism, where we see the lesser gods of this kind of pantheistic respect begin to take on human-like characteristics, both in personality and in physical depiction. As well as we start seeing archetypes like the mother goddess or goddess of fertility that plays a really crucial role in the survival of all of these ancient civilizations. And we can see a common thread that can be woven through many of these civilizations, like Inanna in ancient Sumeria, Ishtar in Babylon, Anat in Canaan, Isis in Egypt, and Aphrodite in Greece. Really, these are all the same god of fertility. Finally, we see monotheism enter the stage with the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and we see a hybridized version of the Canaanite tradition as well as his God of Israel. And it's believed that he partook in a philosophy of monolateralism, which is an acknowledgement of many possible gods while only actually worshiping another. Finally, Moses comes along to start the actual religion of Judaism after he receives an epiphany on top of Mount Horeb. And this God is given the name of Yahweh, and Yahweh will continue to intervene in the lives of his believers throughout all of human history, which is a major departure from the polytheistic beliefs of beforehand. We get into the scientific revolution, Einstein. I'm going to assume none of you have heard of luminiferous ether, because as a paradigm, that's been entirely shed since the times of Einstein. However, before that, it was a very knowledgeable, well-understood concept because it described how light would travel. And we understood that light traveled in waves, and we understood that ocean waves must travel through water. We also understood that sound waves had to travel through air, so therefore something had to carry light. The model revolution comes when we can't explain this nature of light, and we have competing theories from James Maxwell Clerk, Michael Faraday, Michelson, and Morley, who all get close but not quite there. And then in 1905, Albert Einstein publishes 4 groundbreaking papers, one of which is on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, which contained his special theory of relativity, in which he posited that there really is no objective space, and really what it is a motion relative to a practically rigid body of reference. Essentially, he posits the scientific theory of relativism that will affect our philosophy to come. And this entirely shed the ether because it did not require any propagation of light, because light traveled at a constant speed no matter what frame of reference you were in. And this is just a quick graphic of what it would look like dropping a ball from a moving carriage. and how the different relative frames of view would affect that. Finally, the last revolution I looked at was actually 3 parts, and it stems from a strain of thinking called from the Enlightenment era. And the main scholars here were John Locke, Voltaire, and Baron de Montesquieu, who would have impactful roles on both the United States Revolution as well as the French Revolution, as well as the Haitian Revolution. And the main idea that they posited was one of classical liberalism, which rejected prevailing social and political norms, hereditary privilege, state religion, absolute monarchy, and the divine right of kings. And they also introduced the concept of deism, which accepted that there was a one true God who could reign supreme. However, when it came to politics, we were submitted to only the laws of nature. Essentially, it separated our religious institutions from our political institutions, which I'm sure many of you as Americans are familiar with. Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet was instrumental in spreading the word of the Enlightenment. The Declaration of Independence echoed Locke's words in his 2 treaties almost exactly, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, or as Thomas Jefferson changed it to, the pursuit of happiness. No taxation without representation, separation of powers, as well as a form of republican government that we continue today, evolved from this liberal belief. The French Revolution was also based on similar Enlightenment ideals and monarchy that was becoming overly self-indulgent, a bad harvest, deep in debt, and ultimately unpopular taxation schemes. The States General was formed in 1789, and the Third Estate, which represented the greatest population of people and also the lowest class of people, would play an instrumental role. Eventually, the revolution was at its peak when King Louis XVI was executed, basically a first for European monarchies, and sent ripples throughout the rest of Europe. The Haitian Revolution, the final piece in this chapter, was a successful slave revolt in Haiti, inspired by one particular slave, Toussaint L'Ouverture, who was very, very well read on the Enlightenment. And he used these ideals to actively empower the slaves on the island to choose their own freedom and ultimately determine their future. So the Haitian Revolution was an anti-slavery and anti-colonial revolt in the island of Haiti, or Saint Domingue, which lasted from 1791 to 1804, and it was successful. And out of all of these revolutions, it was ultimately successful. So with that, I'll leave you with just a couple takeaways, and then we can get to questions. Activism must be active. It's not something we can do on Facebook. Perfect paradigms do not exist. We must always be searching for something better that can better take care of our problems. We must always be searching for better paradigms, and changing a paradigm requires thinking outside the box. We can't continue the mode of thinking that got us there in the first place. Finally, someone has to take the first step. I'd like to give just a couple special thanks to my wonderful mentor, Dr. Carlos Simoes, for all of his help with the project, outside the project as well, all of our salon talks, a lot of the enlightenment. He's been a mentor in every sense of the word. Also, Dr. Sandra Perez for providing the resources and this wonderful opportunity to present our findings and engage in this, personal introspective journey. Finally, the CSUF honors community as a whole for all of the support they've given me over the last 4 years. And with that, thank you.
All right, so we have 5 minutes for questions, comments from the audience. Yes?
What was your favorite part of undertaking this topic?
As I kind of hinted at, I really liked the religious section of it. As someone who never really had organized religion in his life growing up, it wasn't there. I wasn't raised with it. So getting to kind of go back and look through the history of religion and all of the natural reasons people would be inclined to be drawn towards these symbolic levels of thinking, it was really eye-opening on myself. So it kind of opened me up to greater things, I guess.
I have a question. You talk about, apparently you probably wrote your abstract yourself, correct?
Mm-hmm.
You talk about the tipping point in revolutions, and the United States is, as far as I know, the only government, self-government, that actually gives us the right to revolution in the Declaration of Independence. So where do we get to that tipping point? What things do we see happen right before the tipping point begins?
At the end of the day, I think it comes back to the concept of relative deprivation. And when those kind of mismatch of ideals between the effort that we're putting forth and what we're returning in the end, when that becomes too misbalanced, when we're working 500 hours a week and we're paying $200 for bread, then I think we'll reach that point. But at the end of the day, I think it's just a cost-benefit analysis on an individual level. When are you going to reach your personal tipping point and be willing to take that first step?
And the courage it takes to revolt, not to mention the risk to life and limb. Yes.
Now, one of the things I like about your project is that it shows that, revolutions are interrelated. How can, for example, the scientific revolution lead to a political revolution? How are the two connected?
Well, the scientific revolution was actually pretty simultaneous with the Enlightenment as well. So a lot of these ideas of relativism and a lot of these ideals of searching for answers and meaning outside of kind of the Catholic Church really was instrumental in guiding a lot of thought, especially after the plague, which had kind of just devastated a lot of people's faiths in Europe at the time. So a lot of people started searching for answers in science, objective truth. How can we logically deduce a truth? And so this search for objective truth, Descartes, Spinoza, Einstein, this is kind of a never-ending human quest that can spill into science, it can spill into culture, politics, religion. It's just a really intrinsic human nature convention, I think.
How do you see the relationship between revolutionary leadership and sort of the mass following that happens sometimes?
So the leaders are usually the people who take the first steps, but they don't always end up being the people who are, best suited for the job or born leaders. Toussaint L'Ouverture was born a slave, and ultimately through education and reading about the Enlightenment, he was able to kind of spread these ideals to his fellow slaves and lead the most successful slave revolt and anti-colonial revolution in history. So I think really the qualities of a good leader should be able to express the problems that people are collectively feeling, and then also provide them with an outlet for how they can handle those problems. And the best ones, as I would argue, do so with a paradigm shift.
All right, we'll have to go on to our next speaker. Thank you, Kai.